Welcome back, Honors. Oh, sorry, he's not like looking camera ready right now. He's trying to sleep. All right, so now anyway, thank y'all so much for being so relaxed about yesterday. I heard nothing but good things. Really appreciate it. Just because I ended up having like some family stuff and having to run down to Maryland yesterday. So we're going to pick up right here, kind of where we left off in the midst of everything. Y'all now already have your study guide, so you can go ahead and get started on that. The way it's looking schedule-wise, the ability for us to get a test in before Christmas break is pretty up in the air. All right, so like pretty doubtful, actually. So you will have something to do over Christmas break. Duh, because you're honors babies. You will have something to do over Christmas break, but it shouldn't be too much. All right, so I'll let you know. I'll keep you updated, but it happens sometimes. You got to run out of town. Now, anyway, we left off talking about the Crusades, right? We wrapped up like the 4th and later Crusades, the 5th Crusade, how everything kind of hit the fan. The Christians only really ever had one big success. What we're going to do in this flip is we're going to wrap up the Crusades completely, talk about maybe what some of the motivations were for the entire thing, some behind the curtains kind of stuff, and kind of just see going forward. Also getting into some political tumultuousness that was going on during the Crusades itself. So something I need you to write down about the Crusades really quickly has to pertain to this picture. And you got to remind me on Monday to tell you this story. But the Crusades would begin to become very romanticized. All right? So romanticism is the idea of evoking certain types of emotions onto a story, right? So Romanticism would actually become a complete art trend during the late 1700s, 1800s, following the Industrial Revolution in Europe. So Romanticism, though, is something that has existed for an obscenely long time, right? Now, a particular one was this story called the Children's Crusade, right? So just kind of jot down Romanticism, what it means. Children's Crusade as a good example. And get me to tell you the story on Monday, though, because it definitely romanticizes the Crusaders as being the right, the just, the innocent, right? So going forward, though, the Crusades are going to have a lot of major effects, right? First of all, economically, trade and trade goods are, ironically enough, going to increase, right? People are going to begin to travel a little bit more and move around. So economically speaking, the Crusades may have actually benefited the Middle Ages, especially during the later phases of the Crusades, during the late Middle Ages, right? Now, political changes is also, some lords are going to begin to not return to their land, which is going to lead the king actually taking this land, giving more kings power, so the power of the monarchies is beginning to grow due to the Crusades, right? Now, socially speaking, you have some other changes as well. Christians are going to begin to see Jews and Muslims as enemies, right? And the Muslims are going to see Christians as invaders. So going forward, though, the breakdown, so this and this relate to each other very good. Or very well. What you need to also write down under social changes is many Christian communities are going to be barred from trading with the Islamic communities as well, all right? So this is going to actually lead up in the 1400s to the age of exploration because the Islamics did not allow the Christians to pass through their territory in the pursuit of trade, right? So let's get into some other stuff, though, like some odd things about the Crusades and things like that. Like getting into it a little bit, before the First Crusade, I know this is backtracking a little bit, but it kind of gives credence and precedence to everything. Before the First Crusade, church power had kind of reached its ultimate heights, right? So the First Crusade actually had the ability to even be called because Pope Gregory VII had actually brought them to the biggest power that they had ever had. Papal suprematic power had reached its height by about the 1080s, right? Under Pope Gregory VII, who actually physically had the example of a king being superseded by the Pope himself, right? So Henry IV was actually the Pope, or not the Pope. Henry IV was actually the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, right? He actually takes over and actually expands a lot of these different growth systems. And whoa, that was on accident. Actually expands a lot of these different growth systems, pushes things forward. But Henry IV, being the Holy Roman Empire, was wildly immature. Very young leader. And he actually tried to take on the Pope's power mano a mano, right? He actually goes to the Pope and he says, I refuse to be locked into this marriage anymore. I would like to break out of it, because he wanted to marry a different woman for political reasons, right? And Pope says no, right? So Gregory refuses to let him get a divorce, And then what the Henry tries to do is he tries to then bar the Council of Cardinals and other nobles from actually voting properly in the next, in one of the next, rising up of the popes, right? So what Gregory does in response to this is he excommunicates Henry IV, right? He excommunicated the king for his attempts at basically hindering the power of the Pope by taking the nobles and the cardinals out from underneath him, right? So what Henry IV was forced to do was to actually bow before Gregory VII and beg for his power back, right? So Gregory actually basically one-upped the king, papal suprematically speaking. Gregory would also lurch things forward by basically making it so if anybody ever wanted to talk to him or any private counsel, they were forced to get down on their feet and kiss his, or get down on their knees and kiss his feet beforehand. He said the Catholic Church had never wronged and never will wrong for as long as time shall go, and that all power of the Catholic Church is now underneath the Pope himself, right? So the power was huge. Another big thing was that nobles were constantly fighting with one another for land and power, and even with their own kings, right? So a lot of historians believe, fast forwarding to the First Crusade, that Urban II, when he actually called the First Crusade in the 1090s, might have just wanted to unite Europe against a common enemy, right? So by doing this, a lot of historians believe that Pope Urban might have saved the political state of Europe and aided the growth of Europe in the High Middle Ages because he was just trying to get them to come forward and go against an enemy as a united force. Now, another big thing about it is Pope Urban actually never claimed that the Crusades to be a holy war. He actually called them a pilgrimage in the first place, hoping the Islams may actually attack, leading to a crusade-like type of situation in the long run. Also, the Crusades were very, very correlated with a high influx of funds into the Catholic Church, right? So then also, most Crusaders, just to give you a heads up, were nobles who were leading bands of poor. Very, very few of them, like we talked about with the Crusading Knights, were these heavily armored, bulked up, massive, gilded knights going forward into, gilded as in being covered in gold and being garbage on the inside, going into the Crusades to fight for Christ, right? So it actually was a lot of poor people being led by bands of nobles and things like that. One of the funniest things about one of these nobles is one of them actually drowned because he bet a bunch of other nobles that he could cross a river in his armor, and then his armor was too heavy, and he actually sunk to the bottom and he drowned. So a lot of different things like that are going to happen. But really, really quick getting into it, write this down before the stuff we talk about in class on Monday, right? So meanwhile in England, ding, 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 like a little blur back, right? A little flashback. During the Third Crusade, King Richard the Lionhearted, a.k.a. King Richard I, was off doing his gallant thing, being the lion-hearted guy, and wrecking house and trying to basically take down Saladin and protect Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem ends up falling into Muslim hands during the Third Crusade. Well, funny thing about him, he was actually a garbage king. He only ever spent 10 months in England, and the only times he ever came back was to raise funds for other wars he wanted to fight, right? Another funny thing about it is when he was forced to leave and head back to England in 1199, he actually was kidnapped by another noble in Austria, right? And he was held for ransom. So in his absence, his youngest brother, King John, was actually taking over as king. He doesn't even get a number. He's technically like a steward of the crown at first, right? So in 1199, Richard is released after John basically told the guy king. Okay, so this noble in Austria said, "Hey, you owe us 60,000 British pounds in the equivalent for us to release this king. For if you want Richard back alive, give us all this money." King John said, "Nah, you can keep him. I'll pay you more money to hold on to him," right? Well, reluctantly, the noble in Austria releases King Richard, and he ends up dying a little bit later on. So King John takes over the crown. Well, something about John is he also was a garbage king. Bad public administrator, and his biggest beef was with the French because the French were starting to try and jockey for position and take the land back that actually William of Normandy brought in. Because remember, when we looked at William of Normandy bringing in England, he not only brought in most of England underneath Scotland, but also the north of France, right? So Philip, one of the kings of France, actually fights King John, leading to a massive, write this down somewhere, leading to massive debt in England, and he ends up losing all the French lands that William of Normandy had actually brought in to the King of France. What a pansy, right? So as you can see, the political stuff in England, like on the heels of the Crusades, very tumultuous, very shaky, all over the place. But on Monday, we're going to get into actually what happened following that, It's a very, very important document, probably the most important document from the Middle Ages, and possibly the most important event in the Middle Ages outside the plague, right? So, but that's it. We're going to wrap up there. We finished up the Crusades, talked about the effects, talked about the lead up, talked about a lot of little quid pro quo stuff, and then got into the setting the stage in England, right? Oh, man. So I know that was a lot, especially the Gregory VII, Henry IV story. Look, hey, when you're a king and you got to get down and kiss a pope's feet, you got to do what you got to do, right? But we will talk more about this and review it a lot on Monday, and we'll talk about what you're going to be doing over the break. And yeah, I hope y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you guys then. Have a good one.